The story I'm about to tell you is very chilling. My name is Natalia, and I was a nurse at a state hospital in America. I worked the night shift on certain days of the week. My colleague and I were responsible for the entire third floor. It all started one night while I was working at the hospital. We didn't have many patients. It was a very quiet night when suddenly I heard a very chilling scream from one of the rooms at the end of the corridor. I immediately ran to check the only 2 rooms occupied that night in that corridor. But when I entered, both patients were asleep, so it wasn't them. I went into the other rooms to check if anyone was inside because I was sure I had heard it. But all the other rooms were empty. I went to the other wing of the floor to check on the other patients because my coworker had asked me to cover for him. Since he had to make an urgent phone call, I was in a patient's room giving them their medication so they could sleep when that scream, or whatever it was heard again in the distance. At the end of the other corridor, it was a chilling thing, and I even heard a sound like the moan of an injured animal. I don't know how to describe something so terrifying. My patient heard it too and just looked at me. I immediately went outside and walked down the corridor again and heard the sound again, but I was sure it was coming from room 23. I approached the door and hesitated twice before opening it because I was scared. I opened the door very slowly, turned on the light, and the room was completely empty. I turned off the light and closed the door. I was about to leave when I heard someone crying from the same room. It sounded like a small child crying. I didn't want to go back and open the door. I preferred to wait for my friend, but the crying and moaning continued. It was very frightening. Finally, my friend came back, and I told him what had happened. I asked him to come with me to check again. While he was gone, we could hear someone crying in that room. We both went to check. As we got closer, we could hear a child crying inside. My friend signaled to me and motioned for me to be quiet as he slowly opened the door. But when we opened the door completely, the crying stopped. We turned on the lights, and the room was empty. We were very surprised. We left and tried to find an explanation, but we couldn't. My friend had to go back to work in his area, and I continued to look after other patients in my area. Time passed, and while I was attending to a young patient who had been there for a few days, he asked me about the child in room 23. I heard him crying, and he cries a lot. I hear him crying at night. Doesn't his family come to see him, or what's wrong with him? I didn't know what to say, because it was the first time I had heard him crying. I told him there was no patient in that room, and that there were no children staying on that floor. At that moment, he looked at me in surprise and didn't answer for a few seconds. I asked him what was wrong, and he said that every night a little child came to look into his room, didn't open the door completely, but just watched him through the small opening in the door. But the child never answered him, just left. And he could see from his room's window that the child went into room 23. And that's why he thought there was a little patient there. After telling me all this, he looked at me with eyes full of both uncertainty and fear. Actually, I was very scared too, but I didn't want to upset him and affect his health. So I told him that maybe I was wrong, that there might be a child spirit on the other side of that floor, but that he shouldn't worry. But he wasn't very convinced. I went straight to find my roommate and told him what the young man had told me. He was as surprised as I was and didn't know what to say. He just said he didn't believe in ghosts, but there was nothing else he could do. We were both new. We knew very little about that hospital. We didn't know the story of that room. The next day, when I went to work, I learned that a patient had been admitted that day. She was a woman in her 40s and would be staying in my department. But when the doctor told me which room she was in, I didn't know what to say. They had put her in room 23. I didn't say anything at that moment. But as the doctor was leaving and telling me what medications and care to give the woman, I couldn't help but ask him why they had put her there. The doctor looked at me suspiciously and asked if there was a problem. I said no, it was just a question, because I didn't want to tell him the truth. Telling him something like that would have embarrassed me too much. I knew he wouldn't believe me, so I went about my work as I did every night. Hours passed, and around 11 o'clock, all the patients were asleep. But suddenly, I heard a scream. This time, it wasn't the scream I'd heard before, but it was still coming. From the end of the corridor of room 23, I ran to see what was happening. When I entered the room, the newly admitted woman was lying on the floor. I rushed to lift her up, and she excitedly told me to turn on the light. She seemed very frightened. I lifted her up and turned on the light. I asked her what had happened, and she said, "I was about to fall asleep when a small hand touched my arm, and then I heard a small whisper I couldn't understand. I was so scared that I jumped out of bed and fell. I was speechless, not knowing how to respond. I just asked if she had seen anyone, but she said no. There was no one in the room, but she asked me not to leave her alone because she was very scared. She said she had felt fear and anxiety ever since she was put in that room. She said she had asked the doctor last night if her husband could stay with them, but the hospital was very strict about it and wouldn't allow it. She asked me to stay with her until she fell asleep, and I agreed. I told her to calm down, that everything would be okay, that I would be there with her, and that's how it was. I can't explain the energy I felt there while I was there. I wasn't comfortable, but I couldn't leave the woman alone. Thanks to the medication, the woman fell asleep quickly. I turned off the light and went to check on my other patients. But less than 3 minutes after I left, I heard a terrible scream. That scream was coming from the child I had heard the night before. I ran because I knew the woman was there. When I went inside and turned on the light, the woman was lying unconscious on the floor. She had had a heart attack. I immediately called the doctor who was at the hospital at the time, and we tried to revive her repeatedly. I swear we did everything we could to save her life, but it didn't work. The woman died. The doctor asked me if anything unusual had happened, because the woman had been admitted for stomach problems, and her condition wasn't serious, so he couldn't explain why she suddenly had a heart attack. I couldn't take it anymore, and told him everything that had happened. Since the previous day, trying to appear strong and not cry, he said to me, "Okay, calm down. Come to the cafeteria when your shift is over. Let's talk." I didn't know what he wanted, but I agreed. When my morning shift ended, I went to the cafe, as the doctor had asked. He said, "Sit down. I want to tell you something," and began to explain what he was thinking. He was an elderly doctor who had worked at that hospital for many years. He told me that when he first started working there, the place belonged to a very powerful former senator, and that what he was about to tell me was for my own good, that he couldn't leave this place, and that for my own safety, he couldn't tell anyone. Back then, this hospital was used many times to commit crimes. He meant illegal trade. I don't want to be too explicit, but you understand what I mean. This was the real business that this senator did with another criminal organization. And they did everything in the hospital basement, where there were only storage rooms. It used to be a place where materials were stored. I asked him what all this had to do with the child I told him about. He said to me, one night, they brought in a child who was very badly injured. He had been in a traffic accident. They took him to intensive care and then put him in room 23. His family said goodbye to him at night when visiting. Hours ended and went home. But when they came back the next day to see him, the nurses told them their son was no longer in the room. They had left him there while he was sleeping, but the nurses couldn't find him in the room during their morning rounds. They said they searched everywhere in the hospital, but found no trace of him. The mother and father couldn't believe what they were hearing. The mother started screaming about how they could have been so careless. She started shouting, "Did you notify the police?" But they replied, no, because the hospital director at the time had forbidden notifying the police. Not wanting a scandal, the enraged father immediately went outside and alerted the authorities. The police arrived immediately and began questioning the staff, requesting the camera recordings, but they were told that the cameras weren't working, which was already quite suspicious. So they requested backup to search the hospital from top to bottom. When they reached the basement, they were met with a very disturbing sight. Again, I won't go into details, but I'll leave it to your imagination. It was a massacre. That's all I'll say. You can imagine what they found. They found the remains of the little boy, but they never found the perpetrators because they had all fled with the senator. And that senator has never been found to this day. The hospital was closed for several years, but a lot of money was paid to keep all this from coming to light. So not many people know the story of this hospital. But getting back to the point, that child was one of many victims. His life was taken in a very horrific way, and a few years later, when the hospital reopened under new owners, many people staying in room 23 experienced paranormal events in their rooms. Many moved to other rooms, and many even saw that child and spoke to him. That child continued to wander those corridors to this day. I thanked my doctor for telling me this story. This story made me feel much more tense and a little sad. But in the end, I understood everything. I now knew who that child was and why he screamed at night. After a while, I was transferred to another hospital, but I remained friends with my old roommate. He told me everything that happened in that place, in that room. To be honest, he had gotten used to that room, but they no longer put patients in it. In fact, the room remained locked. I hope you enjoyed my story. Tragic as it is, before moving on to the next story, I'd like to ask you to like this video so I can understand whether you like our content or not. Thank you very much. Let's continue. Hello, the story I'm about to tell you took place a few years ago while I was working at an old hospital in a small town near Los Angeles. My name is Martina, and I'm a retired nurse. At the time, I was transferred to that hospital because there was a severe shortage of staff. It was a very old, small public hospital that had fallen into disrepair years ago. Nuns worked at that hospital. In the first few days of starting work, things were a bit difficult there because there was very little equipment and a large number of patients came every day. At that time, there were only 4 nurses besides me, and we couldn't keep up with the work. So I started staying overnight because only one colleague and I could do that. As we didn't have children like our other colleagues, everyone worked in their own area. I looked after 4 elderly people entrusted to me at night. One morning, around 2:30, one of my patients called me. I went immediately to see what she needed. It was Dona Elenita, as they affectionately called her. She was an elderly woman. hospitalized there due to lung problems and always had to be connected to a nasal cannula. A nasal cannula is a tube that provides oxygen to patients who need it. When I entered her room, the woman had a look of horror on her face. She told me that a nun had entered her room without saying a word, her face covered with a veil, grabbed her wrist and squeezed it very hard, and asked why they hired such people. The first thing I did was check her wrist, and there really was a large handprint. I was very scared because there was no nun there, and no one could enter that area at night because the doors to those rooms were locked and only hospital staff could enter, as visitors were not allowed after a certain hour. So I asked the woman if she was sure she saw it, because only the other nurse and I were in the hospital. The security guards were at the reception desk, and as I said, no one could enter the rooms. She answered me very confidently and confirmed what she had just told me. When she started screaming, the nun quickly left the room, and I left there in a state of shock. First, I went to my coworker and told her what had happened. She was even more surprised than I was and told me she hadn't seen anyone there, that the hospital was empty. She told me to go to the security guards and ask them. I did that, but they told me that no one had entered the hospital, that they hadn't left their posts. So, if someone had entered, they would have noticed. I returned to work in a daze, went to check on my other patients, and they were all asleep. But when I went back into Dona Elenita's room, the breathing tube was gone, and she showed no vital signs. There was nothing we could do for her. The next day, I told her doctor what she had told me before she died, that someone must have removed the tube from her nose. But the doctor told me it was a sign. She was an old woman, and perhaps she had told me this because she was on her deathbed. She had probably removed the tube herself. Regarding the marks I saw on her wrists, the doctor said they found nothing during the autopsy. He told me that Dona Elenita was now in a better place and that I shouldn't worry. I tried to forget, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next night I went to work, as usual. I only had 3 patients. One of them, an elderly gentleman, was talking to someone in his room. It was past 10. Visiting hours were over. Visitors weren't allowed, so I went to check on him. But there was no one in the room. I asked the gentleman who he was talking to. He said it was a nun who had come to his room to pray for him. He was just looking at her, or so he thought, because he couldn't see her eyes as they were covered by a black veil. He said he asked her who she was, but she never answered. I ran to the reception desk and asked the security guards if the security cameras in the corridors were working. They said only a few were working. I wanted to watch the videos. In the videos, we saw a tall woman dressed as a nun walking around the hospital corridors, entering some rooms, and her silhouette disappearing when she left the rooms. When the security guards saw this, they searched the entire hospital but found nothing. I was a little scared, but I had to get back to work. The security guards told me they would stay alert and to let them know if anything happened. I went back to the room, but when I entered, I saw something that took my breath away. The man was lying lifeless with his eyes open and a rosary on his chest. When they came to take his body away, I started crying. I was very confused. The man's condition wasn't serious. In fact, he was about to be discharged soon. He was getting better and better. I knew what he was. The nun that patients talk about before they die, and that appears in the hospital's videos. It was the nun seen in the hospital videos. I went to talk to the doctor, but he said that, according to the autopsy report, The man had died of natural causes, and that I shouldn't worry. Then 2 new patients arrived that night. So I had a lot of work to do. I couldn't neglect them because their lives were in danger. Every 10 minutes, I would walk around to make sure everything was okay. Around 3 a.m., I passed by the room of a patient who had arrived that day. The room light was off because the patient was sleeping. When I looked through the window, I saw a very large shadow standing in the corner of the room. I wanted to open the door to turn on the light, but the door was locked, which was impossible, because the patient couldn't get up and close the door by themselves. I immediately took out my keys, but I couldn't find them in that room. When those shadows returned, they were approaching the woman's bed very slowly. I can't describe to you the adrenaline rush I felt because I couldn't find the key. The only thing I could do to help the woman was to shout at her not to do anything, to please leave her alone. But as she approached the bed, that nun appeared, dressed in black and wearing a veil covering her face. But when I saw her hands, I almost fainted because they were pale, with purple veins showing, and her nails were dirty, long, and unkempt. I knew this wasn't human, that she wasn't well, and so I screamed loudly for help, because no key would open the door, but no one heard me. I begged her to go away and not hurt the woman, but it was as if she enjoyed watching me. The woman woke up to my screams, and when she saw the nun standing right next to her, she screamed with intense fear in her eyes. Suddenly, she slowly passed out on the bed and remained motionless with her eyes open. She was dead. I jumped to the floor and started crying and screaming. At that moment, my friend came running and asked what had happened, why I was like this. I couldn't speak. I could only say that the woman was dead, that the nun had taken her life, too. My friend didn't understand what I was saying and opened the door as if nothing had happened. I no longer had my key. We both went inside and turned on the light. The woman was lying lifeless on the bed, but the nun was gone. I couldn't stop crying. That morning I handed in my resignation because I couldn't take all this pressure anymore, and no one believed me. Not even the guards who saw her in the video. There was no evidence that the victims had been murdered. All the autopsies showed natural causes. So, after I resigned, there was nothing left to do but go to the village church and pray. To pray, I needed to talk to someone, and back then there was no psychological therapy, at least not in that village. Because it wasn't widespread yet, I told the nun what I had experienced. She said she believed me, and was almost certain that the nun I was talking about was the head nun who ran the hospital at the time. She said that her aunt, who was a nun, was a cold woman, only interested in money, and used her position to steal. But one day, she got cancer, and when her condition became very serious, the nuns decided to take her off life support because she had no relatives or anyone to care for her, and she thought her spirit was wandering around the hospital taking revenge for what they had done to her. That woman didn't want to die. It was definitely a horrific experience and made me question why I should continue working in hospitals long ago. I was working as a nurse in a small clinic. It was a private and very expensive clinic with very few staff. As I said, the clinic was only 2 stories high. I worked there at night because I had to look after my small children during the day. On that shift, there was only another nurse, the receptionist, and me. The doctor wasn't there at night. Except for emergencies, there were very few inpatients there. I would see at most 6 people, and even that was a lot. Among the patients staying there at the time was an elderly woman who had been there for a few days. Her kidneys weren't working, and her health was very fragile. Her children had gone to great lengths to get her admitted to this clinic because, as I said, it was a very expensive place. One night, I was going around the rooms to check on the patients. But when I came to the woman's room, I was met with a terrible sight. The woman had taken her own life. There was nothing we could do for her now. She had no vital signs left. She had left a letter for her children, saying she couldn't bear to watch them struggle to find money for her treatment any longer, that she knew there was no cure for her illness, and that was why she had decided on this tragic outcome. Days passed after that dark event, and one night, while I was completely alone in the hospital cafeteria, I saw a shadow pass by the window. I couldn't see who it was clearly through the window, because the blinds were half closed, but I knew it was a patient because I could see the white coat worn in the hospital. I went outside to see who it was, but the corridor was empty. I went to the reception desk on the floor where the cafeteria was located and asked the receptionist if she had seen a patient walking on that floor, but she told me no one had passed by there, so I went upstairs to check on all the patients. But they were all in their rooms that night. At that moment, my other nurse friend, who was working that shift, came and asked if we had a new patient. No. Why do you ask? I said. She seemed confused. She told me that when she got out of her car, there had been a tragedy in one of the rooms upstairs, in the corner room. This struck me as odd, because that room hadn't been used since then. I thought someone had been admitted there. I told her no one new had been admitted, and that I had even gone to their rooms to check on all the patients, and found them all asleep in their rooms. We looked at each other for a few seconds, because we couldn't find an explanation. We went to get coffee while discussing what had happened. At that moment, the janitor, who had only been working there for a week, excitedly told us that a patient on the upper floor needed help and that we had to hurry. We immediately ran to the second floor, but all the patients were sleeping very peacefully. Getting a little angry, I went over to the man and asked him why he had said such a thing, and that this was not something to joke about. He looked at me in surprise and said, "For God's sake, it wasn't a lie. God is my witness that I didn't lie." While cleaning the second floor corridor, I saw an elderly woman standing at the end of the corridor, but her wrists were bleeding, and she was crying, upset about it. I ran to tell you. I didn't know what to do. My friend and I looked at each other without saying a word. He told the gentleman that everything was fine, not to worry, thanked him very much for telling us, and left him. Then he touched my shoulder and said to me, "She's the woman who took her own life on that tragic day." I didn't want to believe it. But what other explanation could there be after that night? My friend and I continued to see a woman looking out of the room's window every evening when we came. Some of our patients also said they saw a woman walking in the corridors from their room windows. They said they saw her wandering the corridors. Many times, they called us to say a patient needed help, wandering the corridors crying. The patients thought that woman was someone staying there, because they didn't know the old woman's story. We just thanked them for letting us know, but we never told them the truth. We didn't want to scare them. They said that seeing her looking out the window, or seeing a spirit wandering the hospital corridors, meant that she had ended her life in a very tragic way, and that her spirit had not found peace. A few years later, I moved away from the city, but I kept in touch with my coworker. Over the years, he told me that the old woman was still trapped there, and that he thought she would never leave, and that the room was being used as a storage room for cleaning supplies. The patients who remained there said that at night, an old woman watched them from the corner of the room, but then disappeared. Thank you for listening to my experiences. This job is certainly not for everyone. If you have experienced similar paranormal events, please share them in the comments. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video.